So this restricts me because, as you know, I like to walk around when I teach. And Kim very explicitly said, you need to stand this close to the microphone to eliminate some of the humming that happens. And then, of course, with the camera, walking in and out of the frame shots, probably not a good idea. But I'll do my best to stay glued to the lectern. If you remember last week, Russell, with a little help from the good Lord, got Paul and Silas out of prison in Philippi. You remember that great story of them preaching and Paul finally casting the demon out of the slave girl that was a fortune teller. And when he did that, her owners were not happy because they had taken away their means of making a living. So Paul and Silas, both being Roman citizens, were seized, beaten, and thrown into the deepest, dankest part of the prison there in Philippi. You remember God caused an earthquake, and all their shackles were loosened. And the Philippian jailer, thinking that everyone had escaped, knowing what awaited him, was about to commit himself by taking his sword and running himself through. And you remember Paul called out, "Don't harm yourself, we're all here." And they had the privilege of leading the Philippian jailer, his entire family, to faith in Jesus Christ. Now you remember Russell talked about, even though the way the Bible expressed it, it sounded like because the jailer became a Christian, that his entire household was saved too. That's not the way it works. How many times have you talked to someone that said, "Well, you know what? I'm not that worried about it. My mama was a Christian." Or, "You know what? My grandfather was a preacher." Well, that's great. But what's your relationship with the Lord? And that's what matters. And that's what Paul was so good at getting to the heart of. You know, you think about Paul's ministry from where he started to where he finished up, and it's an incredible story. Paul and Peter, two of the greatest men and two of the greatest preachers, not only in biblical history, but in the history of the world. Paul put up with a lot. We'll see that they were gluttons for punishment, but they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. Because where did they always get in trouble? Going to the synagogue. What did they do in every town that they went to? They went to the synagogue. Because that was the place that they were going to be able to lead people to the Lord. So, Acts 17, and we'll look at the map. I'll get to them later to kind of run back. But we'll read Acts 17, and then we'll run back and look at the map. And I'm going to share between these two fine people. They'll read our scriptures.
Now, when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he visited them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead, saying, "This Jesus, whom I am proclaiming to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large number of the God-fearing Greeks and a significant number of the leading women. But the Jews became jealous, and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. And they attacked the house of Jason and were seeking to bring them out to the people. When they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some brothers before the city authorities and shouting, "These men who have upset the world have come here also, and Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." They stirred up the crowd, and the city authorities heard these things. And when they had received a pledge from Jason and the others, they returned.
So Paul and Silas and Timothy, Kim, if you'll scroll back up to that map, went to the Macedonian port city of Thessalonica on the second missionary journey. Why do you think that the Jews in the synagogues were so upset with Paul and Silas? They were trying to proselytize too. So Paul and Silas were taking people out of the synagogue that might ordinarily be a part of that. The Jews then accused Jason, who had hosted them, of harboring traitors to Caesar. Where's the first time we heard that? What did they accuse Jesus of before they crucified him? Being a traitor to Caesar. So then the authorities took Jason and required him to post a peace bond and let them leave the city. So they went to the synagogue in Thessalonica in verse 1. They stayed overnight in Amphipolis, which is 33 miles down the Egnatian Road, which would be, in that time, a day's journey by horse. The next day, they traveled another 27 miles west-southwest to Apollonia, and then 35 miles on the Via Egnatia took them to Thessalonica, which is modern-day Salonika. Tim, if you'll run it up a little bit, you can see where they started. See where Philippi is, then to Thessalonica, then to Berea. Then we'll talk about how we think Paul got to Athens. It's spectacular. We'll talk a little bit. I've got some pictures from a trip that we were fortunate enough to go on with Jeff and Valeria. Paul reasoned with them in the synagogue for 3 Sabbath days. So we know that they were there for at least 3 weeks. Now, we think maybe that they were there a little longer than that, because sometimes what Paul would do is preach in the synagogue and then talk to the Gentiles about Jesus. Anybody know what Paul's, other than being a preacher, what his profession was? He was a tent maker. Well, Paul probably supported himself during that time by making tents and received gifts from the Philippians. Verse 3, I love verse 3. I think it was the great Vance Havner that they asked him why he preached on the cross so much. And he said, I pick a text anywhere in the Bible and make a beeline for the cross. But what did Paul say? Explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead. And this is a theme throughout Paul's preaching. Verse 5. Verse 5 really talks about rabble-rousers. You know what a rabble-rouser is? Somebody that causes trouble when they shouldn't be causing trouble. These were hired rabble-rousers, hired by the Jews to attack Paul and Silas, and this was somewhat common in Greco-Roman cities. A lot of times, a speaker would speak in the marketplace, and they would gather around and either applaud or heckle according to who paid them. And then verses 6 and 7, one of the greatest passages in the Bible, and I'll tell you why. They did not find them. They began dragging Jason and some brothers before the city authorities, shouting, these men who have upset the world have come here also. What would it be like for somebody to say that about us? Those, they said, who are upsetting the civilized world have arrived here. One of the greatest compliments ever paid to Christianity. When Christianity really goes into action, it needs to cause a revolution. Not necessarily the kind of revolution that we're seeing across the country today, but there is application there. These men were turning the world upside down for Jesus. I was sharing before class, as y'all know, my dad passed away a year ago, December. And one of my most treasured possessions, as my mom turns them over, my dad wrote out every sermon he ever preached on index cards. He just used them to reference, but that was the way he did it. Before Dad surrendered to be a preacher, he was an engineering student at Louisiana Tech. So his handwriting is spectacular, that squared off engineering type handwriting. And I was looking through one of the series of sermons that he preached. And one of the themes was, if every church member were like me, what kind of church would it be? That's a sobering thought. I don't know about you, I wouldn't want every church member to be like me. That wouldn't be good for anybody. But it is something that we should think about. All right, Jeff, if you come up and read Paul and Berea.
Brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea, And when they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. Now these people were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, for they received the word with great eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. Therefore, many of them believed, along with a significant number of prominent Greek men and women. But when the Jews of Thessalonica found out the word of God had been proclaimed by Paul in Berea also, they came there as well, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then immediately the brothers sent Paul out to go as far as the sea, and Silas and Timothy remained there. Now those who escorted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they left.
So for the second time, Paul had to leave a city under the cover of night. They left Thessalonica to head for Berea, which is about 45 miles south-southwest of Thessalonica. It was an old Macedonian city, off the beaten path a little bit. And they launched their ministry again by visiting where? The local synagogue. It is interesting the reception that they received in Berea. The folks there were much more accepting of Paul's preaching. They did not react out of jealousy like the synagogue and the Jews had in Thessalonica. They listened very carefully. They received the word and compared it to their Hebrew scriptures. Now, there's a lesson there for us also. If we're going to be who we should be, we need to spend time in the word. Many of the noble skeptics believed that Paul's teaching was consistent with the Old Testament. And because it was consistent with the Old Testament, there were many Jewish converts as well as many Gentiles that believed. And among them were a number of prominent men and women. So 45 miles from Thessalonica to Berea. When the Thessalonian Jews heard of Paul's presence in Berea, they followed him and used the same tactics that they had used to force him out of Thessalonica. So they rush him out of town. We don't know if it was a feint to go toward the sea. We don't know if Paul got to Athens by ship or whether he went by land. Now, it would have been a much easier journey by ship because it's 195 miles from Berea to Athens. So Paul goes to Athens, and it's one of the most incredible scenes and stories in all the New Testament. Athens is 5 miles from the port of Piraeus. If you've ever been on a cruise or been to Athens, you'll know that the port of Piraeus still stands today. The city had reached its prime 500 years before Paul had visited in the time of Pericles, who lived from 461 to 429. As y'all know, I love historical perspective. So to give you historical perspective, during that era, the events of the book of Nehemiah took place. And the post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, it was during their ministry. Athens was still the cultural and intellectual center of the Greek world. Paul observed many of the temples and statues that still stand there today. Athens today is a spectacular city, and a lot of it is in ruins. Can you imagine what it was like in Paul's day before those great things have crumbled and almost gone away? Now, here's the downside to Athens. The architecture and the buildings are spectacular. But almost to a building, what were they built for? Idols to other gods. As spectacular as it was, they were there for the wrong reason. Well, today these areas are mainly known for their artistic value. They were places of worship then that the Greeks regarded as holy. All right, Catherine.
Now, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he observed that the city was full of idols. So he was reasoning in the synagogues with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. And some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers as well were conversing with him. Some were saying, "What could this scavenger of tidbits want to say?" Others, "He seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is which you are proclaiming? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears. So we want to know what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new.
Verse 16, it was said at that time that there were more statues of the gods in Athens than in the rest of Greece combined. Petronius, the ancient historian, said in Athens it was easier to meet a god than it was a man. We could spend all day talking about Epicureans and Stoics, a very unique approach to life. The Epicureans believed that matter was eternal, so that there was no God as creator. The Stoics believed that God was everywhere and in everything. It was pantheism. Pantheism is the belief that all the forces in the universe are God. An example of pantheism is rejecting the idea that God has an individual personality. Their doctrine that God is not a personality, but that all laws, forces, manifestations, etc. of the universe are God. So God is everywhere, but not in the way that we believe it. They believe that God and the universe were one and the same, so God couldn't create himself. And so Paul just shot down that philosophy with the first statement about who God is. He tells them that he is the creator of all things. The Epicureans got their name from Epicurus, who was a philosopher in ancient Athens and started this particular movement. He lived from 341 to 270, so this is approximately 400 years later. Now, the Epicureans were interesting. They believed that everything happened by chance, that there was no real rhyme or reason for anything. Nobody was running the show. It all kind of happened as it happened. They were the rationalists. They believed also that death was the end of everything. You died, however you were buried, that was it. They believed, three, that there were gods, and they believed in every one of them, but they figured that the gods were remote and had better things to do than to get involved in their lives. Now, if you believe that everything happens by chance and death is the end of everything, and that nobody up there cares, and that there will be no day of judgment, then the fourth principle of the Epicureans is an easy one. Pleasure is the main purpose in life. If there are no repercussions, hey, why not? They believe that pleasure is the chief end of man. John MacArthur said that translated into the modern day, grab all the gusto you can get, you only go around once. It is a very beer version of existentialism. Death was the end of everything, and you just went to the grave and it was all over. The gods didn't care. If that's the way it really was, I'd probably be an Epicurean. But as we know, that is not the way it is. Grab it here, grab it now, do your own thing, live it up, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Then you had the Stoics. The Stoics were kind of the tree huggers of their day. Zeno was their founder, and he lived from 340 to 265 BC. They really were kind of the nice guys. They weren't out for themselves. They were a humanitarian bunch. They believed, first of all, that everything was God. Well, that's a little different because they believed the trees were God, the earth was God, and the skies were God. Buildings were God, everything and everybody. Birds were God, snakes were God, the fish were God, water was God. It was pantheism, which in essence is atheism. You believe everything, but really you believe nothing. If everything is God, then nothing is God. And they also believed in self-sufficiency. Epicureans. Many of these traits on both sides are still with us today, aren't they? All we have to do is look around. Today's society teaches us, or attempts to be self-reliant. That's a challenge for a lot of us. It's a challenge for me. I think I need to make it. I need to do it on my own. I don't think I need any help. It was kind of like the little boy that was on the roof, and he slipped and fell and was getting ready to fall off and cried out, "Oh, Lord, please save me." About that time, his pants grabbed on a nail. He said, "Dear Lord, that's okay. I made other arrangements." So sometimes we don't see providence intervening on our behalf. So we talked about the Areopagus. This was a famous court that had charge of all religious and educational matters in Athens. It was named because it originally met on a hill called Areopagus, which we know as Mars Hill. If you were to literally translate Areopagus, it comes out as Hill of Ares, and Ares was who? Mars, which is the Latin version of it. The word Areopagus in verse 19 and the words Mars Hill in verse 22 are the same Greek word, Areopagus. Now, while it was a place, it was also a court. In essence, it was the Supreme Court of Athens. And remember, it was this same court that had tried and condemned Socrates 400 years before. Now, we've got some pictures from our trip. Kim, if you have those. It was fascinating to me that Mars Hill literally sits in the shadow of the Acropolis. So this is from the Acropolis looking down. See the rock out cropping behind the tall cedar? That is Mars Hill. We'll go to the next one. That's what it looks like up close. So possibly there was a structure at some point. We don't know. They may have, the weather in Athens is pretty nice. They may have held court outside. If we'll go to the next one. Another picture of what it looked like from up above. This is what it looks like down on the ground looking up toward the rock. There's a plaque there that talks about Mars Hill. When we got there and looked at the plaque, I actually said it's Greek to me because it's printed in Greek, and I don't read Greek very well. And then the last one, I think there's one more maybe, is from Mars Hill looking back up at the Acropolis. If you ever have the opportunity, I would encourage you to visit Athens. It is a spectacular place from an architectural standpoint. And I will tell you, you talk about chills running up and down your spine, to know that we were standing on the spot where Paul preached his sermon on Mars Hill to the Areopagus and the Athenians. It's just incredible to think that its history, in essence, come to life. So the sermon on Mars Hill, Jeff, if you'll come to read that, please.
So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that you are very religious in all aspects. But while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything that is in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made by hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might feel around for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of our own poets have said, for we also are his descendants. Therefore, since we are descendants of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by human skill and thought. So having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now proclaiming to mankind that all people, everywhere, are to repent, because he has set a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all people by raising him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to scoff, but others said, "We shall hear from you again concerning this." So Paul went out from among them. But some men joined him and believed, among whom were also Dionysius, the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them.
While it would be great to think of the Greeks and the Athenians as seekers of knowledge, which is why they had Paul come and speak, it really was more of entertainment value to them than it was of them really wanting to know what Paul had to say. It almost sounds like Paul was commending them on their religious nature. It wasn't. He was telling them they were religious, but they had no idea what they were doing. Paul was more than capable of holding his own in an environment like this. Why? He grew up under the feet of the learned Gamaliel, was as educated as anyone in the ancient world. He had Roman citizenship. He grew up in Tarsus, so he would have been familiar. Tarsus had incredible Hellenistic influence, so he would have been familiar with all things Greek, with their culture, their history, their poets. So leave it to Paul to find the one altar, now there may have been several scattered around the city, that said to an unknown God, and have the ability to turn it into one of the greatest sermons ever preached. The Greeks prided themselves, particularly the Athenians, on being racially superior to all other people. Yet Paul told them that they, like all people, had descended from one source, Adam. Is that applicable today? There's nothing in the New Testament or Old Testament that's applicable today, is it? We all need to learn that, regardless of what side of the political divide you find yourself on, and it is a divide, we are all created equal. Doesn't appear that way. The way that one side, and I'm certainly firmly on one side, can't get along with the other. But we need to realize that we all descended from the same source. He also told them that God determines the times of nations, their seasons, when they rise and fall, and their boundaries. God is sovereign over political and military affairs of nations. I had to read that about 6 times. God is sovereign over political and military affairs of nations. Why did I have to read it 6 times? Because sometimes it doesn't seem that way. When my person doesn't win, I kind of want to know what God's trying to do here, because it doesn't make sense to me. The Greeks also like to think that they determined their own destiny. Paul here quoted Epicureans, who according to legend had advised the Athenians to erect anonymous altars. He also quoted other Greek poets that his audience would have been familiar with. Paul had the ability to relate on any level. You want to be intellectual? Paul could do that. You were a slave? Paul could speak to you on that level as well. He has presented God as the creator in his past work. He shows God as the redeemer in his present work, and then shows God as the judge in his future work. I don't know that it originated with Paul, but Paul may have been the first one that incorporated the 3 points of poem and a prayer that all Baptist preacher boys learn when they're in college. Wiersbe outlined Paul's speech as presenting the greatness of God. He is creator, the goodness of God, he is provider, the government of God, he is ruler, and the grace of God, he is Savior. And you've heard me say it on numerous occasions, where would we be without grace? The response of the Athenians to Paul's teaching was typical. Some mocked, and a lot of times you mock what you don't understand. Others procrastinated, and a few believed. Dionysius, who was a member of the council of the Areopagus that had examined Paul, and Damaris, a woman that we never read about again in the New Testament. We really don't know what happened to her. Now, Dionysius is another matter. Eusebius, the historian, wrote that Dionysius became the first bishop of the church in Athens. Now, it doesn't say that in the Bible, but Eusebius was a fairly well-known historian. Another 3 points of Paul. In his sermon, he told them that God is. He then told them who God is. And then he told them what God says. We don't know if Paul was disappointed in the fruits of his preaching in Athens. Though converts were few, we always need to remember that we never know what the impact of one, two, or a small group of people may be. Dionysius truly was the first bishop of Athens. He may have had the opportunity to lead numerous people to Jesus. And if Paul hadn't gone to Athens, he may have never known what the good news was. Paul faced an increasingly anti-Christian culture. Does that have any application today? There was no spirit of tolerance. Does that have any application today? Paul going to Athens at that time would be like him going to the campus of an Ivy League school today, except that those institutions have no excuse. They were founded as Christian institutions and have now become like ancient Athens, highly intellectual, highly educated, but ignorant. And I would say that is true across the board. Every Ivy League school was founded on Christian principles, and they are so far away from that today that it's unbelievable. So as we look at Paul's teaching and preaching, in order to be effective, he says that 1, we need to confess our sins. 2, we need to study the word. 3, it has to be personal. We need to apply it to our lives. And then 4, we need to share it.